Welcome to the Lean Focus Podcast, where we bring you inspiring stories of lean transformation with your host, Damon Baker.
I want to talk about when success in a company can hide drift. Phil, GE Aerospace is probably one of the most respected industrial businesses in the world, and you had a strong performance, a deep Six Sigma legacy, and a long history of operational excellence. But over time, especially through periods of heavy product development and growth, some of that day-to-day operational discipline began to fade. Can you take us back to that moment? What did you see in the business that told you something foundational needed to change?
Well, I can't take credit for that moment. Larry saw it before we did. But really, it pointed back to not only, as you said, we had the heritage, but what was happening is we weren't running the business consistently operationally. And as you mentioned, we went through a period of having to refresh our entire portfolio. And as we came out of that, it became pretty clear that inconsistency of that operational discipline, it started to show up in that our reviews became, frankly, more financial outcomes rather than focusing on the operational discipline. You know, at that point, we were part of a large industrial. We didn't call it a conglomerate, but we were the big GE. And ultimately, you know, there might be one part of the company that was short and we needed to pull some levers. They typically became financial. And so that kind of crept into the culture a little bit. And I think it's was the fresh eyes from Larry coming on board that really highlighted the need to get back to that discipline.
And for those that may be unfamiliar with the GE story, Larry is Larry Culp, the new CEO of GE at the time, which I think was around 2018 or so, if I'm not mistaken. So going back to the finance-driven piece of the operating review, in your mind, how had an organization so steeped in process improvement drifted from this operational style management of actually improving the work more towards a finance-driven model of review?
Yeah, I'll share from my perspective because back when I started, I was actually a Six Sigma black belt. And, you know, what I'd say is it became over a number of years a little more performative, where we started to count projects, number of green belt projects, black belt projects. And we lost a little discipline on how we tied that to customer outcomes or the bottom line. So I think that was part of how it drifted, where we went a bit away from where it started, which is let's apply these great tools to drive continuous improvement on what matters to the customer, what matters to our employees and the shareholder. And then we got a little more performative in terms of counting the number of projects. That's probably where the drift started. The other piece of it, and we can, I think, get into it later, we classically have been functionally aligned, and we use matrices to sort of tie together the business. And I think, you know, as we operated over time, we became a little more siloed than we wanted to be. And I think that fed into it as well. And so, you know, that's been a little more of a breakthrough, is that this transformation sort of enabled, you know, as we've had more focus on really value stream thinking connected to the customer.
Yeah. What I think is interesting about this GE story, at least this particular segment of GE that you operate in, which you refer to it now as aerospace, is that correct?
That's right.
So there wasn't sort of the prototypical crisis necessarily at that point in time. The business was performing well, but then leadership, to your point, started to step back and really listen to customers, driven by Larry's arrival. And it became clear that there's this gap. And as you work to strengthen this operational discipline, how did the customer insight begin influencing what capabilities you built into the business, and where you actually focused first with the lean transformation?
You know, I think in any lean transformation, you have to be really humble and transparent on what's working and what's not. Now, I remember a very poignant operating review where the question was asked around a customer KPI, and this one KPI is aircraft on ground. So we have aircraft that can't be put into revenue service because of an engine item. And someone asked the question, would our customer measure this the same way? And this is one of those light bulb moments, is like, of course they wouldn't agree with that. So that one moment in that operating review kind of set off, I'd say, um, a reaction in the business. But it became sort of a rallying cry. And that combined with some customer feedback where, we were doing really well from an investor perspective, but we said this externally, that our customers weren't as happy with us. And so not only did we have to change some KPIs, that's now a Hoshin item for us here this year, because there's some new capability we need to build in addition to changing how we measure what success looks like in the eyes of the customer. But that was a real rallying cry for us.
Yeah, I think a lot of those moments that you described, they start with a simple question like that, where we look inward, looking outward to see how we can benefit for the customer, but raising the bar on ourselves, redefining the standard of success. So in your mind, what's the danger of a business that is waiting for a quote unquote problem by their own standards before they actually change something? Because by all intents and purposes, you were green in this metric for a long time, it looks like.
Yeah, we were. And, it's interesting as I reflect back to that time period too. We were green, and we were green financially. Market share was strong. But frankly, as we have more of an orientation now to continuous improvement and being more humble about what's not working, there was so much waste in front of us. And I think we now see that through things like employee surveys and where we can really drive up overburden for our employees, dissatisfaction. And I think if you sort of wait for that, that moment, that big moment, you're frankly missing out on other maybe softer signals that you could be working on that to the benefit of not only your customers but your employees. But I think too often when you wait for that crisis, it's probably a little too late. And we were fortunate; we had a great coach, but at the top of the helm. But at the same time, we were also focused on some of our leadership behaviors, which we can get into a little bit as well.
Yeah. So I want to kind of get into the history a little bit of GE, which, you can read case study after case study on decades of improvement initiatives. And I can imagine when Larry comes in and you're sort of redefining what the next chapter of this looks like, that you encountered a lot of skepticism, understandably, and people had seen programs kind of come and go. You mentioned Six Sigma earlier. I know that even before that, there was some stuff around demand flow, I think, and JIT kind of early 80s, and maybe many other things I'm missing. So people had seen a lot of change. Where did the skepticism show up most in your memory, and how did leadership begin to overcome it?
Yeah, the skepticism, I would say, showed up probably outside of operations. Obviously, when you first start focusing on a lean operating system, it resonates the most probably in operations. I'd say non-operations. What did it look like? It's interesting. We're a Midwestern global company, but a little bit of Midwestern nice. And so probably folks that were, again, back to performative, seemed like they were on the bus, but really weren't, taking the torch and trying to get reps. And so I would say what it looked like early on is you'd see, we use this term lean bingo, a lot of lean bingo, a lot of words like Gemba and Kaizen, but not a lot of action behind it. I'd say
so they were using the words, like in reviews and things like that, to act like they were assimilating the culture. Is that kind of what you're saying is performative?
Yeah, perform. And then so you'd be in a review and you'd hear things like, "Oh yeah, we have daily management around that," and then you ask the question, "Well, so who's in that daily management? Where does it occur?" So talk about what you're measuring. And that's when you really we got to the crux of, okay, we're not accelerating in some places as much as others. And so that's a little bit how it showed up.
Yeah. In your view, when you guys started to transition from this financial focused review process and the operating review in particular to this
Yeah.
focus on safety, quality, delivery, and cost management, because to me, that was probably pretty transformational. I don't
Yeah.
think in any of those decades of initiatives that GE led an operating review kind of starting there.
Yes. So, and this gets to the heart of your question. Like, so where did that pivot start to occur relative to the skepticism? And even before we branded our lean operating system Flight Deck, we had a couple of years under our belt where the operating cadence changed. We really skinnied down the number of KPIs. As you said, they're organized in the order as safety, quality, delivery, cost, cash, in that order. That was transformational from a couple of reasons. One, there's no debate about what we're going to measure. There was a real standard around how we were going to show the KPIs through bowlers and what we were going to do when they were read, problem solve, and that each one had to have a rigorous action plan. And that consistency, it's like anything with lean, consistency is what really gives you capability. It was that consistency over those first couple of years before we branded anything that people got comfortable and frankly saw a better way, because we got into this mode of storytelling. What's the next story we're going to tell at our next review? It became a lot easier. We're going to talk about these KPIs in this order. We don't have yellows. We don't really talk much about greens. What are we going to talk about in reds? And on our reds. And that really, I think, started to break through some of the skepticism, is that consistent way we operate, the consistent messaging, the consistent approach.
Did you mention functions as well? Did the organizational structure around reviews have to change to facilitate that? Because I can imagine that these functions kind of operated their own reviews where they may have been prioritizing initiatives and KPIs that can be completely at odds with what the customer thinks important or what the business needs. And you get this proliferation of metrics at all levels because of this vertical thinking versus horizontal thinking. Does any of that resonate? Did that happen as well?
It did. And fast forward, we have made some organizational change where we're more organized by true P&Ls now. So all the functions, line up more naturally. But back in the early days, we had to be pretty prescriptive around who was at what operating reviews, who owned which KPIs, and how we talked about them. And so I think that was a pretty big breakthrough in terms of those early days of making sure that we were problem solving together cross functionally, and that we showed joint ownership, right, of those 14 KPIs. So we had to be pretty prescriptive early days. And I think some of those reps, as I said, started to move us in a direction that then we accelerated, frankly, through the org changes that have happened over the last couple of years that really crystallized it in terms of a new org structure.
I think you witnessed the playbook. So now you start having these KPIs. You're looking at reds. The next question becomes, what do we do about the reds? So early in the journey, you brought in experienced lean operators and created this immersive learning experience. So it didn't become train in lean. It became let's do lean to solve problems, focusing on these red KPIs. So why, in your view, was it so important for leaders to experience lean firsthand by doing rather than just learning the concepts in a classroom or in a e-learning module?
Yeah, I don't know that we're unlike other companies where there's a proud heritage. If you haven't experienced what good looks like around a lean operating system, it's easy to kind of put up barriers to say, why do we need to do that? That's not that sophisticated a problem solving. Why are we not doing a design of experiment to fix that issue? And so one of the things that we did pretty early on, and it's not unlike other companies have done, but we found a site. This happened to be a manufacturing site that was accelerating in terms of how they were adopting the operating system. And not only were they getting outcomes from a customer, an employee, and a financial perspective, the culture was starting to change where you could feel that continuous improvement culture. You walked in the door and it was less kind of led from the top and more problem solving, and the leading of the shop was from the employees closest to the work. So at that point, that became, our leadership academy. We didn't call it that, but we started to, have a 1 week training where we'd spend time so people could really not only in a classroom environment see what flight deck or operating system was all about, but then immerse themselves and see it and understand from those that were on the journey what went well, what didn't, so that it became a lot more tangible about how they could go back and apply it and get on the journey themselves. So it just started to be the nucleus of showing people, one, it's possible. It makes your job easier. You can hit your metrics easier, and the culture changes for the better.
In your view, was the expectation that leadership in GE Aerospace go see problems firsthand at Gemba at the point of impact, as you just described, to the front line, a new behavior? And as a result of that, what changes did you see in those leaders when they started to actually spend time, like purposeful time at the Gemba?
I'm going to rewind for just a second. Around, call it the 2018, 2019 timeframe, our leadership behaviors, we had new leadership behaviors that were humility, transparency, and focus, which were absolutely needed at the time. We needed to be more humble. With all the complexity in our KPIs, we weren't as transparent about where issues were, and we were not as focused enough. About 2 years ago, we pivoted that to respect for people, customer driven, and continuous improvement, what you would imagine. But I say that because we had to start with that humility, transparency, and focus, because as you're kind of alluding to, it wasn't a natural act for folks to go to where the issues were. We're a proud engineering and program management site. We really didn't see or admit in all cases the connectivity between something our manufacturing team or our sales team was struggling with that could have been created, way upstream. And so we had to be pretty prescriptive to get folks comfortable to be out at the point of impact and go in there, as we say, right, with 2 ears and one mouth, so that you're listening more than you're talking. So I'd say we're still on that journey, but there's a much more of I'd say a comfort level. And that's a little bit as we go through our op cadence, as we talk about our reds, we talk about what's the Gemba evidence. What did you see? Where did you go? Who did you go with? What did the team say? Because that's it's a journey, but we're definitely down the path there. And frankly, we're getting to the issues a lot quicker, and obviously getting better ideas for solutions, because it's the people that are dealing every day with the process.
You mentioned earlier flight deck. So flight deck is GE Aerospace proprietary lean business system model. So to me, that's a real demonstration of commitment when you made that leap to establish flight deck as your enterprise operating model. And then you launched as a standalone company at or around the same time, I believe. So why was that moment of launching flight deck, in your view, such a clear operating system that was critical at the moment? Why was that necessary?
Yeah, and I'll really key in on one of the last words you said, which is system. If we look at the few years before and we started to get those early reps in, clarity of KPIs, standard work around op reviews, when we triggered problem solving, it was starting to feel like a system. But when we launched Flight Deck, we wanted to make it clear how behaviors and fundamentals tied together, but as a system to drive outcomes. And one slide that's been really poignant since we launched Flight Deck, it has strategy on the left, and on the right, you have your operational, financial, and Hoshin outcomes. And in the middle is Flight Deck. There's an arrow across. And we wanted to be really clear that flight deck is how we translate strategy into results. But there's no fork in the road. There's no there's no Venn diagram. It is the way we operate. And so we thought we needed to be very prescriptive that it's not just for one function or another, it's a system, and it's a system to make that translation between strategy and results. And so at that point, it was not only important from a system perspective, but the other thing for us is we were becoming a standalone publicly traded company. We really wanted to articulate that this was actually our way to be able to distinguish ourselves from our competitors. This is a way to have continuous value creation for customers, better jobs for our employees, more fulfilling jobs. And so it was the culmination of the two.
Yeah, what I love about that is you're basically systematize problem solving in the business system itself, by taking strategy, getting those outcomes, and the how becomes the implementation of flight deck. So people don't think that there's a myriad of ways in which we achieve these higher targets in our business. And it resonates with me because that's how we thought about it in Danaher as well. Is like DBS was always the how. We
Yeah.
put faith in no matter what the stretch targets would be, there would be a tool or a process that we could utilize to close the gap and ultimately solve the problem. And it sounds like you're doing something similar there. Out of curiosity, why the name flight deck? I mean, I get the kind of, is there a story behind that?
Not really. As you can imagine, we went through a lot of different versions, but I think it just, the picture, as you can imagine, the graphics we use internally is that flight deck, that cockpit. And it's, ultimately, you can't look backwards. You're looking forwards. You're looking out the window, but you're looking at the key gauges you need to perform with excellence the task at hand. And that's the gauges and the controls in the cockpit. So it was obviously a nod towards our industry, but also I think the visualization too is looking forward, task at hand, critical gauges and controls. If there's an issue, you problem solve. So that's where it came from, but not a huge story.
Yeah. And it sounds like clarity and focus too, like not 1,000 KPIs, 14 enterprise KPIs that define what winning looks like for a business the size of GE Aerospace.
Yeah, and that's been one of the harder to maintain, but it really has helped us as a company of 60,000 people. And that's not to say there's not, some more tracking KPIs at certain parts of the business, but in terms of what we really manage, it truly is 14.
In your view, what does flight deck enable GE Aerospace to do consistently that it couldn't do prior to the formalization of flight deck?
Yeah. So if I'll just go back first to my Six Sigma days, that was very much about solving individual problems. And it was typically a small group that was working on that and benefiting from it. One of the things that I think flight decks enabled is it's really given us this orientation to where the work's done, which really is embedded in empowering that team and enabling and supporting that team, which now brings, in the perfect world, 60,000 problem solvers into the field. And I think one of the biggest things that Flight Deck's done is that expectation that everybody's on the field and we're going to do things, a common way, but ultimately we're striving towards perfection and we're always connected to the customer and we're always working to be better every day. And I'd say, and I've been with GE almost 31 years. I feel really fortunate to have worked in the company this long. But I can tell you one big difference is, that whole aspect of we used to, how do you win that quarter? How do you deliver that quarter? And we tended to be more hockey sticked, and we still have to work, to improve there. But we're getting much better about how to win every day. And then in our best shops, it's like, how do you win every hour? And that's what's exciting to me, because it gets everybody on the field. We're obviously going to get more momentum from it, but it makes the job more fulfilling. And, it's great to hit that, one quarter a year, but it's even better to walk away after and knowing you had a really good day and you served your customer. And that's what flight deck's been bringing us. Still a long way to go. We're in the early innings, but it feels much better.
Absolutely. One of the biggest challenges is shifting, from training to doing to where it becomes natural behavior and it doesn't feel like it's performative and you're doing something that's awkward. So early on, we talked about these challenges about perceptions that people had about, is this another program that will come and go? People may have seen this as a training or something completely different as a new way of operating. Hopefully it was the latter that people viewed it as. So how did you shift the organization from quote unquote learning lean to actually working differently? Because, you go and have these experiences, whether it be a boot camp or a Kaizen event, and you sort of cross your fingers and close your eyes and hope that something sticks and people take this back to their job function and kind of the gospel spreads, but it doesn't happen that way, as I'm sure you can attest to.
Yeah. One of the things that you've got to set the expectation. Early on, like I said, we had some sites that were transforming. We'd have the folks that would go and start to see what's possible. But I'd say after kind of a year in, we started to be very prescriptive, using terms like not optional, but also making sure that we were really showing a path through standard work of how you started on that kind of lean conversion path, that transformation path, but also how we would provide high quality coaching along the way. And I think that coaching aspect mentioned a little bit earlier, that's become a big breakthrough to make sure that we've got the right coaches that, weren't necessarily coming in. Some coaches will come in from companies that are, so far down the line and they can't figure out how to get you from they try to take you from step 1 to step 10.
Yeah. They
But
didn't build the system, so they don't know all the pain they had to endure to get there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd say a point that's really enabled some of the acceleration is getting those right coaches that could take you from step 1 to step 3. And then once you're at step 3 to step 5, but it's really enabled by them rolling up their sleeves. It's not flying in on Monday, being out on Tuesday and coming back 3 weeks later. So that combination of sending people to go see what good looks like, go back, clear expectations, not optional, but also a path through standard work with a good coach. And, through that's where the reps started and you start to see success. And then, there is that, as you know, from your career, there's those breakthrough moments that you start to have those different inflection points.
Were the coaches mostly brought in externally? Were they handpicked from internal executives? Was it a mix? And did you experience any friction there? Because I've seen this story oftentimes happen where a bunch of people get hired from another company who maybe is great at this stuff, and then every opening sentence out of their mouth is, when I was at XYZ company, when we used the XYZ business system, and they forget what their name badge says on their shirt, and people sort of ostracize them.
Damon, we've had everything in between, but let me tell you that just a little bit of that journey. We did have the ones that would come in and they just kept talking about their prior company, those self-selected pretty early, but we had a pretty good success rate because early on we saw an individual that I hired out of operations when I was running our global operations and supply chain, and was just this hands-on individual. And again, was really good at coaching a couple steps ahead of you, but not trying to take you to the promised land. And that really, that really got everybody behind this individual. And then you could start to see the success. And frankly, that individual is running one of the biggest operations we have now. So, showing that path from coach to operational leader. So we had a balance. I don't know if it's 50-50. It's probably around that external versus internal. The thing I'll say, I just did an org and talent review of our flight deck folks within the last couple months. And one of our most successful areas of flight deck adoption and results is in Italy in one of our companies. And when I really started to dissect, like, where did you get this flight deck talent? And the answer surprised me because it wasn't external. It was maybe, I don't know, 15, 20% external. They said it was actually right under their noses. It was the folks in the organization that were very process oriented. They made decisions based on data. And once, we had this system, the operating system, as well as the right leadership behaviors that we were reinforcing, they were in the sunlight and they just took off. They just needed that support. So we found many more right under our nose than we realized, but we had to have that nucleus early on of those folks from the outside that had done it before, but they had to be hands-on.
One of the challenges that you faced and will continue to face is scaling. So you mentioned that GE Aerospace is 60,000 people and growing. And you talked about the lighthouse approach. You talked about immersive boot camps, but you're multiple sites. You're all over the globe. So once those early wins appeared, and now the challenge becomes scale, especially in the areas with the largest performance gaps in the company. What did you focus on to ensure that this could actually scale across the enterprise with flight deck?
Yeah. Well, I want to underscore something. Somebody, I'm stealing this quote, but somebody said, they once said that when you're trying to transform with a lean operating system, communication is as important as safety. But in terms of scale, beyond, as you said, the training, the going in and seeing it at boot camps, at lighthouses. The other thing we saw after about 18 months in, and it was our operating company in Italy, they actually had a transformation approach. We call it a transformation roadmap, which is really just really good value stream analysis and management with a driving towards an ideal state. But what it really, as I saw it, and then I asked them, I'm like, guys, I really want to understand your standard work. It really got into how they stabilized through daily management, 5S, standard work, and in their case, TPM. And then how they had a series of future state value stream maps that were going towards their ideal state that drove their Kaizen roadmap. So they might, as they were trying to develop their capability, once they had good standard work and daily management, they wanted to then, how do we start to be able to respond to issues within tact time? So that became, their next phase of standardizing and optimizing. And then now more recently, they're bringing all their lines to single piece flow, which is huge benefit. What it started to show us is there's an approach that regardless of your site you can use. And frankly, I started to bring my transactional folks to that site, and they figured out that approach works in transactional. And so that's what's really starting to get us to scale now. Again, it's still within the toolkit per se, but it's a standard approach that people can go and experience. And it doesn't matter if they're, in the early phases or the late phases, they're able to learn from it. And now we not only have that site in Italy, we have 4 or 5 sites around the world doing it. And we're bringing our operational leadership teams together multiple times a year now to be able to train on it, see it. And so we're rallied behind it. And now we're going to start the same thing on the transactional side. So again, it's an extension, I think, of what we did in the early stages, but we put it to standard work. We did call it something, but it's still back to showing people how to do it, showing them the standard, and then communicating the progress and having great coaches along the way.
And now, a brief word about our podcast sponsor. Lean Focus knows that the most effective way to improve the bottom line is through lean transformation. And although lean is most often associated with manufacturing, Lean Focus successfully applies the principles of lean thinking to new business growth, innovation, supply chain, mergers and acquisitions, human resources, and beyond. To enact lean transformations, Lean Focus uses the proven tools of the Lean Focus Business System, or LBS for short. To begin your journey of transformation, pause this episode and contact a senior-level LBS expert now at leanfocus.com. Now, back to the podcast.
One of the biggest threats to progress in transforming a culture like this is dilution in the leadership ranks, and that can happen in a number of ways. It can happen through attrition, it can happen through growth, it can happen through acquisition. So how have you guys thought through senior leadership in particular? How are you going to onboard, immerse, teach them, get them to experience flight deck to where they become the advocates, the proponents, the coaches that keep it alive? Because as those people come and go, it can fall apart.
Yeah. Well, we're working it from both ends. I'll start with one of the things I haven't talked about. I was on a couple of calls today. Last time we got our plant leaders together, we said, all right, we really got to start to develop and spend more time developing our frontline leaders. So we're going to do our first TriStorm here in about a month of frontline leader training. Because again, once you get the frontline activated, driving results, the leaders can't stop it. But from a leadership perspective, specific to your question, we actually have a 12-week immersion program. We obviously borrowed that from Danaher, but the whole intent there, and we don't do it for every level of leadership, but as top leaders come in, the whole intent is that when you come out of immersion, you're going to be able to lead through flight deck. And so it's about 75% travel during those 12 weeks. You participate in Shingijutsu Kaizens, you Gemba operating reviews at every level. You're involved in problem solving. And so we really want folks to be able to come out. And they're not going to necessarily be practitioners, but to understand that there's one way that we're going to operate. And then all through it, weekly coaching at a minimum, but frequent coaching to be able to really see how this comes together.
So about a year and a half into this journey, you start to hit this inflection point where some of the lowest performing businesses historically actually began delivering record operational engagement results, which is fantastic. What did those proof points change for the organization in your view?
Yeah, it changed the mindset from expecting or being able to say that like a 5% improvement is good to, wow, we can get 70% improvement. I just remember as we look at this transformation roadmap approach, when folks are starting to get discipline on standard work, 5S, good daily management, they're clicking off 10 plus % improvement. But I was just at our site in New Hampshire, and they took one of their highest volume lines, and they had done all the stabilized and standardized part, and then they had a pretty significant Kaizen where they went to single piece flow, and they had a 70% improvement in basically every metric. And that's really become an inflection point because when, our teams, we have a lot of tenured folks. That tends to be a very complex plant. And when you take people to a plant that's known to be complex, and a lot of people have worked there, and they see from the folks that are really respected, that are in it every day, to say, yeah, we thought we were at entitlement. We don't use that word anymore, but entitlement 2 years ago, we could never take more lead time out. We could never take more cost out. And they took like 70% out. Some of the storytelling, there are tears involved. That's really created this inflection point. And the other thing is they look to see how people's careers change as a result. That leader was just promoted. So we've got to put our money where our mouth is relative to how we're recognizing those skills and those leaders that are developing those skills. Because that's part of the flywheel as well. But that's really what's creating the next inflection point to see beyond the kind of incremental gains to what's possible, which is same time frame, much, much more.
You mentioned just recently you're starting to take transactional teams to some of these lighthouses to see what good lean looks like. And I think this is probably, for a lot of companies, this is the untouched frontier. Lean kind of lives in the factories, and a lot of the headache and pain that operations lives with is a byproduct of what happens in the knowledge work, or in carpet land, as we call it in Lean Focus. And even the cost profile and the shadow of costs, you look at 70% of design costs are built into design that you now experience in manufacturing. Many organizations have 20 to 30 to 40% SG&A, yet it's not an area that we aim the lean toolbox at for some odd reason. And there's going to that probably on a whole nother podcast. So in your view, why is it important for GE Aerospace to demonstrate success outside of the factory?
Yeah, you kind of alluded to it. 70% of the opportunity or issues could be outside of the factory. But the reason we think it's so important is there's nothing that we don't do that isn't cross-functional in nature. And the other piece of it is what really frustrates employees and zaps their ability to be creative and productive is processes that don't work well. And within manufacturing plants, you have to, by design, try to be as efficient as you can with those processes, but we tend to live with a lot more waste and overburden in, as you say, carpet land. And then that obviously, will find its way down close to the customer. One place that we started, and it was leader led, and as you know, this is all leader led. If you don't have a leader that is, full throated behind it, considers it no other way to lead, has high expectations, high standards, you're probably not going to make progress. We had a leader in one of our toughest transactional parts of the business. It's where we manage our multi-billion-dollar long-term services agreements. And, the process that they had to use was so cross-functional. There were terrible handoffs, rework cycles, and ultimately the lead time exceeded what the internal customer expected. And it was a burn and churn organization that had huge financial sort of consequences. When that leader, I remember I took the leader to Italy to that site, and she was about a year or so into her transformation, and she was already, I would say at a higher speed relative to going after flight deck. It put her in another gear, and she's now in year 4 of her transformation. And we now have the same results as that New Hampshire example. She's probably at 80% improvement in terms of her lead time, rework reduction.
It's a great segue to where I want to go next with you, from tools to behaviors. So flight deck, in the beginning began as this toolbox, and I think you guys, you realized early on, and this was intentional, that at some point the behaviors need to be identified alongside the tools. So when did you start to notice behavioral shift was happening, and what leadership behaviors specifically did you notice were changing? Can you give some examples of those?
Yeah. I'll start with, before we really branded it and officially launched Flight Deck, we were an organization that, really wanted to be successful, wanted to talk about success. And through that time period of really focusing in on those 14 KPIs, but have an operating cadence where we really didn't give oxygen to talk the greens. We gave oxygen to talk the reds, but not in a way that we were prey to, as you've probably sometimes heard, we're not prey-to-ing people, we're prey-to-ing to get to process. It took a number of reps, but that started to really, those behavioral change in terms of how coaching was happening started to make the organization a little more open to talk about issues, because we prescribed who was in the room for those op reviews. You started to see more dialogue about, those handoffs and where something, up or downstream might have been affected. That was a real breakthrough for us in terms of kind of that humility and transparency. I'd say the second inflection point and this was around what you're getting at earlier, around that comfort to really go to where the issues are as a listener and as a learner, but with intent. That really happened once we started to really train out where the action was happening. I was proud early career GE person where we used to have our management institute in Crotonville, New York. It was a beautiful facility. We'd have, Harvard professors come in, but you'd leave and you didn't have as much that you'd go back with. I think when we made that pivot that folks would be able to go and see what good looks like, it started to bring down the barriers, and they'd see it with their peers. They'd see their peers, leading differently. It really brought down the barriers that I think we sometimes put up when we're not comfortable. And so, and it really reinforced, our first behavior, respect for people and respect for going to where they, and one subtle change that we made, we don't call them leadership behaviors anymore. We call them behaviors because we all need to exhibit them. But I think that was the other inflection point, when we really start to go where the value was created, to reinforce that if we're not creating value, we're support. And I think that was a pretty big breakthrough.
Yeah, you basically turn the pyramid upside down.
You got it.
You've said a site has truly transformed when you go to Gemba and you see alignment from the daily metrics all the way to enterprise performance. What specifically are you looking for when you assess whether or not the transformation is real?
Yeah, for me, when I go to a site, I spend the first half day just experiencing daily management at every level. I'll start at the floor and work my way up. And if I see a high performing site that's really, transforming through flight deck, you start to see one real focus at daily management on overused term, but when in the day, but a real ability to be able to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff relative to where to focus immediately coming out of that daily management meeting, to be able to turn that red to a green. And the other thing I always look for is what gets escalated and why. And earlier in the journey, you find that folks will escalate way more than they should. And it's likely because we haven't invested enough or enabled enough or empowered enough those closest to the work to problem solve. Those best sites, most of the problem solving is done point of impact. But reacting to issues is one thing. The real telltale sign is how much process improvement is going on as you go to the Gemba. And that's a big differentiator where you'll be going through a line and you'll have a discussion with an operator, and they'll just naturally share with you, the experiment that they're running, why they're running it, what the impact's going to be. That's when you start to see, wow, you can't stop this. It's totally led by the folk closest to the work. So those are some of the indicators I look for.
It's great. And of course, the cleaning solution and wet paint and all those things that people do when leaders show up for a plant visit.
Exactly. Like I can't remember if I said this earlier, but one of my former colleagues said we're pleasers and overachievers. So early days, people would be like, "Hey," when I used to run the factories, people I know were making, "Hey, what was Phil looking for?" And I remember when we first rolled out daily management, I went to a site and we just put up 23 daily management boards. And that's a balance too. You got to be, as a leader, it's natural, right? You're focused on daily management, standard, we're going to quickly get the standard. But again, it's that balance point between the performative, I'm following a process versus I'm following a process and I'm getting results.
Yeah.
And those that are doing the best have the best balance.
Yeah, more of something good doesn't make it better.
Well said.
You talked earlier about the big shift of moving from financial results in the operating reviews to safety, quality, delivery, and cost. But I think probably equally as important, or maybe even more important, is this organization around the org chart around value streams versus functions. How has that shift changed how the organization thinks and works?
Yeah. What I'd say is we were making progress, but we've also hardwired some of it. As I said, we used to be more functionally aligned, that connected through matrices. And I remember we got to the point, we had a pretty big org change a few years ago. And one of the things that Larry shared was, I said, wow, when we have, quality operations and engineering focused on a problem at the point of impact, it's like magic. It's absolute magic. The speed, the results. And so we had to hardwire some of that. And I think it was probably closer to how a lot of businesses run, with a pure play P&L. But we were starting to get some of those early reps in where folks were, seeing beyond their function, but it was taking a little too long. And I think that hardwiring has really gotten us to accelerate, and really, you have to see, when you're in a P&L and all functions are represented, you have to see yourself in the value stream. So it's been a little bit of a both, how to teach it, but we've done a fair amount of hardwiring as well.
Yeah. And you made some commitments to actually change the org chart, which I think demonstrates your commitment level. So what stands out to me in this journey isn't that Flight Deck is this grassroots initiative or a program. It's a leader-led, it's consistent, and it's embedded into how the business runs, how you execute strategy, how you deliver results for your customers or your shareholders and your employees. So for the readers and leaders listening to this session, what's the most important thing you would like them to walk away with and understand about sustaining transformation like this at scale?
I go back to, you just reinforced it, but you said it earlier. The most important thing is it's got to be leader led. It's like anything. It's like safety. If you walk past a safety item in a plant, that one time you do it, maybe that's not going to cause everything to fall down. But people are watching, and really there's that skepticism that you hit on earlier that we got to work through, but it's making sure that, said Jim Collins, do you have the right folks on the bus? That's one thing I've learned in my career. It doesn't mean they get kicked off the bus, but maybe there's a different seat. But when you're really trying to drive a lean operating system, and it's anchored in respect for people, customer focus, and continuous improvement, you've got to unequivocally have the right leaders in the right seats. Because what I've seen and experienced, again, if you don't have that full-throated 100% commitment of a leader with high standards that's going to be able to lead the team through the good times and the bad, that's going to be able to create an environment where they try something that's an absolute failure, but they focus on how they learn from it, but more importantly, what they're going to do in the next 48 hours to take another swing. Like that's for me been the biggest takeaway. Too often we created too much anxiety in the org, where we wanted to perfectly land the ship, and it was going to show up on time, and everything was going to be perfect. So it's great to strive for perfection, but what I've learned along this journey is that continuous improvement mindset is only enabled through leading with conviction in the behaviors that allow people to feel comfortable that they're going to be able to talk about why things failed, but more importantly, give you 3 ideas of what to try next. And so for me, it's really about having the right leaders and leading the right way with those 3 behaviors that we hold so dear, but the most important one being respect for people.
Phil, well said. Thank you so much for sharing the story at GE Aerospace. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Damon. It's been an honor. Thank you for the conversation.
For everyone listening, world-class companies don't wait for failure to change. They change to win differently. If this conversation gave you a new perspective on what leader-led transformation really looks like, share it with the leader who needs to hear it. And as always, stay focused, stay lean.
Thank you for listening to the Lean Focus podcast with host Damon Baker. Please subscribe to this podcast to be notified when a new episode is available. And please consider leaving a 5-star review to support our guests while helping us to spread the word about the power of lean thinking. Until next time.